Hello, welcome everybody to another installment of Battling Ballots from the American Civil War Museum. My name is Stephanie Arduini. I'm the Deputy Director here at the museum, and I'm joined today by Jon White, who is a historian and professor from Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, and author of a book called Emancipation, the Union Army, and the Re-Election of Abraham Lincoln, which, note, was just released in paperback this month. So if you haven't read it, it's a great book. Please go pick it up. But we're here today to talk about the election of 1864 and some of the ways that it compares and contrasts to conversations that we're having today about voting and presidential elections. So Jon, to start, could you just give us a picture about what elections were like in 1864 and specifically that election? What was the landscape? Who were the major party candidates? What were the issues being discussed?
Sure. Well, the main two candidates were Abraham Lincoln, the Republican incumbent, and George B. McClellan, the Democratic challenger. Lincoln also, though, faced a challenge from within his own party. His Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, wanted to run against Lincoln from a more radical position. John C. Fremont, who was a prominent Republican and Union general, also was put forward as a candidate against Lincoln in the summer of 1864. Ultimately, his party rallied around him, though, by late summer, early fall of 1864, so that by the time you got to the election itself, it was Lincoln against McClellan. The election was really important in the sense of we had never had an election while the nation was in the midst of a civil war, and some people worried that Lincoln might not actually hold the election, or that he might postpone it, or that if he lost, he might hold on to power anyway. From Lincoln's perspective, though, he was fighting the war for the Union. He was fighting to prove that democracy was worth saving. And so he was going to hold the election and abide by the result.
Fantastic. And it's amazing when we're talking to visitors here at the museum, for somebody that historians like to say is one of, if not the greatest president we've ever had, just how contested his popularity was at the time of the election, and just how much he barely won in 1860 and how he viewed his prospects in 1864.
That's right. In 1860, he wins with less than 40% of the popular vote. And in 1864, he was highly unpopular. The summer of 1864 went really bad for the Union. The overland campaign outside of Richmond in May and early June of 1864, U.S. Grant suffered something like 60,000 casualties in about a month or so. And while that was going on, Lincoln became convinced that he would not be reelected. In fact, in August of 1864, he wrote a memorandum that he had his cabinet sign, and they signed it without even knowing what they were signing. And so it's now known as the blind memo. And in this memorandum, he said, it's becoming clear that I'm not going to win. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's becoming clear that I'm not going to win. And so I'm going to have to work with the Democrat who wins to help save the Union before I go out of office next year. Fortunately, things took a turn for the better. In the fall of 1864, General Sherman captured Atlanta, Mobile Bay fell to the Union, Sheridan went through the Shenandoah Valley, and when those victories happened for the Union side, that buoyed the support that Lincoln had, and he wound up winning 55% of the popular vote.
So there was a lot at stake in this election. Can you just go into a little bit more detail about what was at stake and how that impacted McClellan and Lincoln's platforms?
Sure. Well, the first thing that was at stake from Lincoln's perspective and most Americans' perspective was union versus disunion. And so Lincoln feared that if he lost, the Union would be lost. It wasn't clear that the Democrats would be willing to prosecute the war. The second thing that would be lost is emancipation. If Abraham Lincoln lost re-election and George B. McClellan became president, it was clear that McClellan was pro-war, but he was not pro-emancipation. And McClellan would have been willing to try to compromise on slavery in order to try to win the war ultimately and bring about restoration of the Union if he could. The thing is, though, the Democratic Party as a whole, they wrote their platform on an anti-war position. And so in their platform, they called the war a failure. And and they nominated a guy named George H. Pendleton for vice president, and he was a Peace Democrat from Ohio. So a lot of people looked at this ticket and they thought, well, sure, McClellan is the presidential candidate, but what happens if he dies? Then you get a Copperhead who becomes the president, and he's on a peace platform. And so a lot of Northerners looked at that and they were not enthusiastic about that. And I think that's especially true of Union soldiers who may have been Democrats before the war, but are going off to fight for the Union. They don't want to be told by the Democratic Party that their efforts in the field are a failure. And one other thing I'll throw in about this moment in 1864, where Lincoln in August is pretty sure he's going to lose. Lincoln called Frederick Douglass to come meet with him at the house. And they met for a long time. And what Lincoln said to him is, you know, I issued this Emancipation Proclamation, and it tried to encourage slaves to run away from their owners and gain freedom in the Union Army or within Union lines. And Lincoln said to Douglass, not as many slaves have run away as I thought they would. And the two men then in Lincoln's office came up with a plan. What can we do to try to free as many slaves as possible before I, Lincoln, lose re-election? And so they came up with this plan where it was sort of modeled on John Brown. They would send what Douglass called bands of scouts into the South to tell the slaves, run away now, get to the North before Lincoln loses re-election. And that says something about Lincoln's priorities. He was favoring freedom. He wanted to do anything he could to bring about freedom before he was out of office.
Absolutely. And you're mentioning soldiers, and I'd like to kind of ask some questions about the soldiers themselves and what it was like for them in the election. Was there a tradition of soldier voting? How would they vote if they're, you know, hundreds or thousands of miles away from their home?
Prior to the Civil War, or I should say at the beginning of the Civil War, there was one state that allowed soldiers to vote, and that was actually my home state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania and New Jersey had passed laws during the War of 1812 enfranchising soldiers. New Jersey repealed its law shortly after that war ended. And so when the Civil War began, Pennsylvania is the only one with a statute on the books. And in 1861, in the fall elections that year for state and local offices, thousands of soldiers voted as far away as Virginia. The problem was there was a tremendous amount of fraud in those elections. I remember coming across a report that there was one regiment from Philadelphia that had 900 votes in a Philadelphia election, even though I think there were something like 60 men who were actually eligible to vote in that election. And so there was a tremendous amount of fraud, and there were court cases that arose out of it, and then contested elections in the state legislature. And in the spring of 1862, the state Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional. While that all was going on, the idea of soldiers voting was not a partisan issue. You had some Republicans who said soldiers shouldn't be voting. You had some Democrats who said soldiers shouldn't be voting. And you had some who said they should be. And in the Midwest, some states actually were allowing soldiers to vote and passing new laws in 1862. And again, it wasn't a major partisan issue. But then the fall elections of 1862 took place. And in those elections, the Democrats trounced the Republicans. And Republicans looked at this and they thought, well, what happened? Well, we think all the Republicans are off fighting, not home able to vote, while the Democrats have stayed home able to vote. And so they began a major push nationwide to enfranchise soldiers. And this is where the idea of having absentee voting became very partisan. In states throughout the North, Republicans now become champions of taking the ballot to the battlefield, whereas Democrats oppose it. Republicans made the case that soldiers of all people deserve the right to vote. If they are sacrificing their lives and their freedom to be on the battlefield, their safety and their comfort, they of all people ought to have the right to have a say in who's going to govern their nation. The Democrats, their challenge was to make an argument that wouldn't seem unpatriotic. How do you oppose that kind of argument when it's true, right? The men who are making a sacrifice on the battlefield, you would think should have a say in the government. And so what Democrats did was they said, well, if we take the ballot to the battlefield, it's going to open up a huge avenue to fraud and intimidation and coercion. And Democrats also made constitutional arguments. Many of the state constitutions back then said that you had to vote in an election district in your home state. And so the challenge became, how do you justify taking the ballot to the battlefield if a state constitution requires you to vote at home?
So then what did the mechanics of voting actually look like for soldiers?
Well, there were 19 states that ultimately adopted laws that permitted voting of soldiers. 4 of those states did it by what we today would call absentee ballot or mail-in ballot. And so they had their soldiers fill out a ballot and an affidavit in the field and then send it home. And they could either send it home by mail, or they could send it home with a person who might be traveling home, or they could give it to a state agent, someone who worked for the state. And those people would then collect thousands of ballots and then take them home. And the idea there was, if the state constitution required you to vote at home, you were filling out your paperwork on the battlefield, but the ballot wasn't actually cast until it was taken home and then put into a ballot box. And so that was known as voting by proxy, and today we would call it something similar to voting by mail or absentee voting. The other 15 states had the soldiers set up polling places in the battlefields or in the camps at the field. And so they would do it by company or by regiment, and the soldiers would elect people to serve as election officials, just like they would if they were voting at home. And they would just set up polls, and they would walk down the company street to their officer's tent and cast ballots there. And I have some images that I can actually show you about what this looked like. These are from illustrated newspapers in 1864. And so this is one, and you can see that they've set up the polling place in the back of a wagon. And the officers in this case are coming up to cast their ballots. Here's another one. This is actually the one I use for the front of my book. And I like this one because you've got a politician talking to a soldier, and he kind of looks like Lincoln. But here you can see they've set up a polling place, and they're doing it on a barrel, presumably a whiskey barrel. And then here's one other one that I'll show of setting up a poll in the field. And you can see these men are standing around these soldiers, and they're deliberating how they're going to vote. But this is what the polling looked like in the field, where just like at home, they would get together, they would pick up their ballots, and they would cast them. Now at home, if you voted, you would vote in an official ballot box, which, believe it or not, was actually usually a glass jar. But in the battlefield, they would use whatever they could, cigar boxes or other things like that.
So did the soldier vote have an impact on the election? Did the Republicans' theory about 1862 have any standing?
Well, the soldiers who voted overwhelmingly Republican. So almost 80% of the soldiers' votes were cast for Lincoln. In my book, I argue that that's a slightly deceptive statistic, because I think there were a lot of soldiers who chose not to vote because there was intimidation. If you were a Democrat in the Army in 1864, you were not going to make that known. There was almost something of what we today would call something like a cancel culture, where I found letters by Democrats who are very afraid to vote their conscience because there's no secrecy in the voting back then, and they're afraid that if they vote Democratic, they might be cashiered or dismissed from the Army. The soldier vote itself probably carried 2 states. New York and Connecticut both had this system where they voted by proxy and sent their ballots home. But in those cases, the soldier vote probably carried New York and Connecticut for Lincoln. The most important soldier vote of 1864, though, happened in Maryland. In 1864, the state of Maryland held an election where they had a referendum on a new state constitution that would abolish slavery in Maryland. And the home vote in Maryland in October of 1864 went against the Constitution, but the soldiers voted overwhelmingly in favor of it. And so soldiers' votes helped bring freedom to Maryland, which is, I think, a really important part of the story.
Absolutely. And that kind of reminds me of, as we're thinking about for example, the 15th Amendment, also your comment about how Republicans were advocating for soldiers to be able to vote because they were putting their lives on the line. That was the same argument that a lot of former United States colored troops and Black Americans were using to make the argument that they should have a constitutionally protected right to vote because they'd put their life on the line during the war. And so this was a right that they had earned, the right to vote.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So I'm curious, as somebody who's studied this and thought deeply about it, what are the takeaways we should be thinking about when we are coming into an election cycle ourselves, when we're having very partisan debates about absentee voting and the security of our election? What takeaways do you see as a historian of this?
I think the biggest takeaway that I see is that there's nothing new under the sun, right? We look at the debates today and they're highly partisan and they seem unusual in some senses, and yet the debate over absentee balloting in 1863 and 64 became highly partisan, with one party saying we should be doing this, of course it makes sense, and the other party saying no, this would be dangerous to elections. And so in a very real sense, the arguments about mail-in voting and absentee voting today mirror the debates that they had in 1864.
And do any of these takeaways influence your choices as you are a citizen in 2020 participating in democracy?
Well, I think the most important thing is for Americans to be engaged and informed and active and voting. You know, I teach a class at CNU that looks at the Declaration of Independence and how it's been used in reform movements over the last 240 years. And so we look at the abolitionist movement and the anti-slavery movement. We look at the push for women's suffrage. We look at the civil rights movements. And in each of these movements, they're pointing to 1776, saying, look at these principles. Let's live up to them. And one of those big principles was the idea of government by consent. And one of the speeches that we read in my class is Lincoln's Lyceum address, where he calls on Americans to remember the sacrifices of generations who have gone before. And so I say to my students, we need to understand and appreciate the sacrifices of those who came before us. And if you're not voting, if you're not engaged and participating and informed, you're taking those sacrifices for granted. And so in a very real sense, the absentee voting that we have today, we need to remember that that is a product to a large extent of a debate that took place during the Civil War, and it's something we should take advantage of. And actually, I'll show you one other image that I think connects to this. So this is a spread from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. And on the one side here, it shows Democrats voting, and you can see what is going on here is you've got two partisans who have gotten a guy drunk and they're taking him to the ballot box. On the other side, let me make sure this is showing here, you've got two veterans, and one is from the War of 1812 and one is from the Civil War, and they're walking together to vote. And you can see that the veteran from the Civil War has been wounded, and yet he's still making sure that he exercises his rights. And of course, that's a very partisan image that was produced in 1864 with the juxtaposition of the Democrats going to the polls versus the Republicans going to the polls. But I think the message is an important one of, you know, not taking for granted the sacrifices of those who have helped secure rights for all Americans today.
Excellent. Thank you, John. This was fantastic. And for anybody who is wondering about their current voter registration status or wants to register to vote, you can go to the nonpartisan website vote.org and check your registration status or register to vote there. But thank you all, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.